I am also no longer in the stage where I only blame BJP or the
Right,
rightist forces. I do realize that our society has chosen that political formation,
right.
and it reflects as much on us as it
It does.
does on that political formation.
Hmm.
So it's not as if the whole Indian population has been taken for a ride. Uh, but people also change their minds. People also learn. We learn. So maybe things will change eventually.
To begin with, because it's the time of pandemic, ongoing pandemic, without any clear sign of post-pandemic happening soon. So I was wondering whether you still continue to think along the line of that category of time, which was at one point of time very instrumental in your work, archival work that you had done,
Sure.
and one had learned that the logic of time leads plays very important role in the formation of categories, some of the political categories.
Hmm, hmm, hmm.
I understand that was in a historical context, but do you still continue to think along that line? Because pandemic is also that kind of time, or maybe one is wishfully thinking about the importance of this time. But would it impact political perceptions, the way politics happens, or the way we perceive politics?
Correct. So I'm glad you started by asking about time, which is not only my earliest topic of work, but also something does that I'm not being able to escape, really,
Yeah.
even if I move into other directions. So you're asking two questions here, and let me just disaggregate them. One is whether we need to think of time as a concept, uh, especially in context of our contemporary. And two, as a result of reopening the concept of time, do we also rethink politics as such?
Right.
Right. So
Hmm.
let me begin with the first. So in my earlier work, I looked at how what we understand as the modern conception of time,
Hmm.
namely time as part of a universal global chronology, time as primarily historical time,
Hmm.
time as a unit of measure of cultural stages across peoples and societies, how that conception of time gets established in the global south. And my argument was that it does not only get established at a discursive level, but at
Hmm.
various material levels, from the making of calendars to the setting up of markets, to the conduct of labor, and so on and so forth. My, I was at that time questioning not just the ideology of progress and modernization, but also the very imagination of time that lay behind that imagination of progress, modernization, development, and such like. Subsequently, I started looking in both directions. One, into the far past, into pre modern times, into pre colonial times, indeed in ancient and archaic times.
Hmm.
And on the other hand, looking towards the future, which of course one has no choice but to, especially in this context when the future seems quite unthinkable, right? We
Hmm.
are in a
Yeah.
suspended time, as it were, where there seems to be no end to this historical moment and an
Hmm.
imagination of an after, as you so rightly said.
Hmm.
Now, since we are having a chat, let me confess that I am feeling a little schizophrenic, a little torn between these two directions in which I want to go in thinking
Hmm.
about time. Now, when I look at, let me start with the contemporary and then I'll talk about the far past. Now, in today's time, the contemporary, which let me call uh, uh, like a formula, a viral digital complex, a moment of time which is primarily defined by uh, viral data and viral entities, um, none of which by themselves produce any meaning,
Hmm.
none of which produce by themselves any narrative. In other words, by themselves, either the story of the virus or the story of big data or digital data does not play into an imagination of a beginning and end, a mediating story. So, in a sense, one faces a loss of narrative, as it were,
Okay.
which is also a loss of temporal thinking, in a manner of speaking.
Hmm.
One of the major symptoms of this condition of being, where there is no narrative to be thought with, except, of course, the ideological narratives of nations rising to global power, and which I believe work in a narrow political field, or seem to work in a narrow political field, but it does not offer meanings to people's intimate lives. Our
Hmm.
lives are not lived in terms of those larger narratives that some political forces are offering. In our everyday life, we suffer from a suspension of narrative and a suspension of imagination of time, or temporal thinking. And one of the biggest symptoms, as I was going to say, is the crisis of the predictive sciences in our contemporary. Now, one of the most interesting aspects of contemporary thought is clearly the transformation of earlier kind of statistical probability calculations, which understood the future in a certain probabilistic terms, to the modern more contemporary predictive sciences, such as, via machine learning, via mathematical modeling, talking about rare events and such like. It seems that despite this transition that we have made, we are still facing an utter crisis of prediction.
Hmm.
And the COVID-19 pandemic, I mean, it's so interesting and so telling that in the US, as late as in October 2019, the US government and a large number of very important hospitals, including Johns Hopkins, were
Hmm.
actually conducting pandemic simulation drills in October 2019.
Hmm.
And we could not predict December 2019, right? And there was
Right.
this massive loss of confidence about human capacity to know what's coming, right? So it is, in a sense, a crisis of prediction. And I imagine, to gesture to your second question,
Hmm.
I imagine that we have to think politics in a very different way when
Right.
our relationship to the future has changed so drastically.
Hmm.
So drastically. I mean, there was still an older variety of apocalyptic imagination that drove our climate crisis kind of thought, that
Hmm.
one day there's going to be the end of the world in an apocalyptic manner. Uh, and of course, in literature, in history, in millenarian thought, the apocalypse has been imagined. And accordingly, political languages that deal with apocalypse have come up in various points in history, including in medieval times, and this is where I look back, but also in very late modern times, the late 1990s, where
Hmm.
entire Hollywood was kind of showing number of apocalyptic movies as popular kind of cinema. So, but what we see today is not even that apocalyptic moment, right? It's
Hmm.
the end of the world in sad, small, inglorious, meaningless, small
Right.
ways. right? So it does not give us that narrative either, the apocalyptic narrative that has so much power, that has so much possibility of human heroism.
Right.
This does not give us that option either. So
Mm.
I am at a loss, and I have absolutely no answer about what political language or what political concept actually captures this
Mm.
um, this sense of time which is of no consequence
Mm.
except in terms of small deaths and small sufferings,
Right.
right?
Mm.
So that's where I look at the future. Hi,
And a lot of
yes.
banality about death and dying.
Lot of banality. That's the word, actually. It's banal.
Mm.
It is so banal.
Mm.
And so we do not know a language of politics which is not revolutionary, which is not heroic.
Right.
And that's something that we have to really invent from thin air, as it were.
Right.
So
Mm.
now, having said that, and this is again to ask, and this is not a quick answer because I am not sure that what I'm saying holds. It seems to be that there is some merit
Mm.
to looking far back in time and trying to think about uh, how how time has variously been politically mobilized
Mm.
in pre-colonial times and pre-modern times, because it seems to us in commonsensically that it is modernity that mobilizes time as a political concept when it talks of progress
Mm.
and backward peoples and advanced peoples and civilized and primitives and such like.
Mm.
But it appears to me as I read more history of the further back, it seems to me that both, I mean, take for example, uh, the Mughal conception of state sovereignty. Why
Mm.
call it Mughal? It's probably more correctly called Timurid or Central Asian. There's this wonderful historian called Afzar Moin, who
Mm.
has written this wonderful book called Millennial Sovereignty,
Okay.
where he shows that both in Central Asia and in North India, under the Mughals, political power was understood as, and political power not only of the Sultan, but
Mm.
also the Sufi master, the king
Oh.
and the saint. The power of the king and the saint was supposed to derive from their deep connection with cosmic constellations.
Mm.
So they would be called what is Sahib Kiran, the lord of conjunctions of stars and planets,
Mm.
right? So the
Mm.
idea that political supremacy depends on a very precise and very rare sense of timeliness,
Mm.
that the best political actors, the lords, are the
Mm.
ones who can ride that cosmic moment.
Mm.
Now, I find that really fascinating as a clue into what we are experiencing
Right.
today. What we're experiencing today is a cosmic, in a kind of both metaphorical and a real sense, a
Mm.
cosmic moment of our planetary transformation,
Mm.
of where what we call the life sciences, what we call the humanities, what we call political philosophy, in some
Mm.
senses come together.
Mm.
And we are seeing a moment of unusual connections between incommensurable entities, right?
Mm.
If, I don't know if you know that this year, very fascinatingly, the entire planetary conjunction that leads to the Dashera, the Puja, and that entire
Yes.
festive,
Yes.
they are absolutely unusual.
Yes. Yes.
It's not like for many years before. So here
Yes.
we are talking about the destruction of the planet. We are seeing very different stellar constellation. We are seeing the virus taking over our lives. Only a political subject with a sense of this particular moment of cosmic connection can be the Sahib Kiran. You see what I mean?
Yes.
So I know it might sound a little speculative and a little of a fantasy, but I do think that our past traditions give us clues in which intimate time, political time, and cosmic time are thought together.
Right.
In a way that we are unable to do because we are modern and we
Yes.
have these separations between the science, between
Right.
technology, and the humanities. And
Hmm.
so I am at this moment torn between looking at the far past
Hmm.
and looking at what appears to be a non future
Hmm.
and trying to think of time in that context.
I suppose it's necessary in exceptional time. One has to operate with exceptional means and very
Yeah,
experimental and speculative and fantastic ideas.
adventurous,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
adventurous. It involves taking great deal of intellectual risk, but there is no other choice. I mean,
Sure,
majority of us are occupied with webinars. At least some of us should take intellectual risk and indulge
sure, yeah.
ourselves in refreshing departures from the way we have been doing history, social history. I'm not very sure about sociologists. I've never been so excited about the tribe of sociologists. So, thankfully, historians are at work. I was in that connection. I was thinking that the idea of political has been, in a way, central to your thinking, and
Sure.
probably that was the reason why, at one point of time, you also wrote this small piece, but it was, to my mind, a very exciting piece, which declared far more politically relevant, Panchtantra far more politically relevant than the Gita, right? And that was a very good pointer for me, because a lot of political philosophers, particularly from South Asia, have been hooked on with the Gita. But in a way, it's right that a different kind of political subjecthood comes to formation when you look at Panchtantra. And likewise, your optimism with once it was experimental, but now I don't know what it has become. But you are still seemingly optimistic with Aam Aadmi Party. Uh, I'm just referring to some of the instances to suggest that the idea of political is important to you, and your upcoming book, which is due sometime this year, I guess.
Yes,
Uh,
December.
Yes, that is also about the idea of political in from the perspective of global South. So I was wondering whether that idea of political and the formation of subjecthood that would be part of discussion in this new book as well, uh, uh, would inform us about the way our subjecthood would be formed in during this different kind of political juncture that we have arrived at during the pandemic.
Sure.
Uh, I mean, as as ordinary uh, supporters, or not so supporting electoral members, are we going to have different kind of subjecthood now? Would we be guided, putting it simply, would we be guided more by our instant fear and paranoia when we make our political choices now? That's the question.
That's a difficult question. I mean, while I work with political ideas and political subjectivities, I do see that I am not the greatest of cephalogists. In other words,
Hmm.
what we know as the domain of party politics,
Hmm.
uh, which to my mind is increasingly getting narrower and narrower, and
Hmm.
very often remains in mismatch to ordinary people's ordinary lives and life concerns.
Right.
Uh, does not, I mean, so this entire formal domain of basically party politics, जिसको हम बोलते हैं, it
Hmm.
does not necessarily reflect our own political preferences and choices. Which
True.
is not to say that we do not vote. We know
Hmm.
that Indians do vote
Hmm.
more than other nationalities do, perhaps.
Hmm.
When we vote, we make a choice in that narrow domain of party,
Hmm.
where very often um, there is a combination of choosing between, as far as I can understand, choosing between the party that promises the most welfare measures,
Right.
uh, the party that gives you self esteem.
Hmm.
And self esteem is something we particularly need when we are in totally miserable condition of
Right.
life. And the
Hmm.
self esteem can have various forms. It can be a virulent self esteem, which requires others to be killed and pulled down,
Right.
or it could be a genuine dignity and a genuine recognition of our aspirations, which is what I thought the Arm Party was once offering. The very valorization of the term ordinary,
Right.
the arm, that itself had a great rhetorical charge. And the clever use of the broom as a political symbol, which
Right.
can signify women's domestic work, degraded caste work, and the cleaning up of the corrupt political sphere as well. So I thought there were very clever moments in that experiment that ARC did. Though I would say that my great optimism is eroded pretty fast, whatever I might write at one point of time.
Hmm.
But also the very basic things like, which really took my fancy, that a parent teachers meeting in a government school can mean
Right.
so much,
It does. It does.
so much
Hmm.
for a person who lives in a slum and is killing herself or himself to put the child through school, and to get even the dignity of facing face to face an educator. I think those were really aspects that went beyond the so-called party ideological
Hmm.
thing that we see. So that I was excited about. I remain excited that there might be glimpses of these interesting things in various parts of the country coming from various political forces.
Hmm.
Um, at the same time, however, I am um, I am also no longer in the stage where I only blame BJP or the
Right.
rightist forces. I do realize that our society has chosen that political formation,
Right.
and it reflects as much on us as it
It does.
does on that political formation.
Hmm.
So it's not as if the whole Indian population has been taken for a ride. Uh, but people also change their minds. People also learn. We learn. So maybe things will change eventually. Now,
Hmm.
what does a person like you and people like you and I do, apart
Hmm.
from the fact that we vote like every other ordinary citizen and
Yes.
vote to the best of our ability, the best we can in this current context? But in terms of thinking, how and what do you think? That do we think that's a real question? That's what you're asking. And
Hmm.
frankly speaking, while I'm very excited about this book coming out in December, the book went to press late in 2018,
Hmm.
and I had no imagination of the virus coming. Right. Now
Obviously.
that the virus has come, I suddenly feel estranged from my own book. I truly hope that people find some relevance for it.
Hmm.
uh, um, but but there are parts of the book that I do think that hold true. And talking of political subjectivity, as you asked, um, so the book, there are two chapters in the book, for instance, which deals directly with the question of what I do not call it subjectivity, I call
Hmm.
it self, because I
Yes.
think that the subjectivity is more of an enlightenment word,
Hmm.
which has its a certain configuration of relationship to the world with the object world, which I'm postponing or suspending, and
Hmm.
talking at a very simple level of the question: who is a political person, right? That kind of a thing. What is a political self? And then I go on to, so I have 2 chapters on it, because I posit these two chapters as contradictions to each other, as opposed to each other. So one political self that I see gradually shaping up in our modern times, say between mid 19th to mid 20th century, which is my period of study, but it also draws from much longer histories. One of them is the renouncer self, the ascetic self, uh,
Yeah.
uh, uh, the one who has stepped out of society to return to society to transform it, as it were. And and you know, and there are so many examples of that rhetoric being mobilized even today.
It does.
Right.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the ascetic self is a very, very contemporary political subjectivity, if you will. The other, and so I draw longer histories of the rise of asceticism as both a critique of caste society and an exit from caste society, etc., etc. And then I bring that to modern times and talk about a number of modern ascetics who become politically iconic, from Gandhi to Vivekanand, but also to Sahajanand, to many communists. So I look at the ascetic idiom cutting across ideologies. So that's one chapter. The other chapter, where in a sense Panchatantra comes to play,
Achha.
is the real political self,
Hmm.
which also draws from a very older tradition of Niti Shastra, starting from Chanakya Kautilya to its anecdotal form, which is Panchatantra, really, which is also a critique of society through absolute cunning and canniness, right?
Right.
As
Right.
opposed to the renouncer, it is deeply interested politics, but it is also asocial in a sense that it does not care for social norms. It critiques society and it holds social norms hostage, as it were, to the cause of political success,
So
political efficacy.
it's not simply Machiavellian then.
It's not simply Machiavellian. I mean, it has a certain so the frame, the common frame that bring the 2 chapters together is the what I call the antisocial critique. In other
Okay.
words, the possibility of critiquing society from 2 outside vantage points, one of the ascetic, the other of a Chanakya-like figure, who is also, none of these are grihasts, right? None of these are householders or part of the standard. They may be Brahmins, they may not be Brahmins, we do not know. I mean, Chanakya is obviously a Brahmin by popular legend, but they are antisocial in that profound sense,
Right.
right? And so which is why I find actually Panchatantra to be so interesting, because it is only hardly about humans, it is about animals, and society can be shown to itself via non-human figures. It is a moment of an external critique that I find so exciting, right? So that's how I look at the political self question. And and the Panchatantra moment, the real political moment, is interesting and different from the ascetic moment, is because the real political moment is actually about everyday small little clevernesses that you can have, small little intelligences that you can mobilize. So of course, the Arthashastra was meant to be read by kings. We know that. But the
Right.
Panchatantra is meant to be read by all people who want to be successful in life. Right? So children are taught the Panchatantra. Right? And so it is an everyday wisdom of political canniness. And it's an everyday subjectivity,
And
which
that
can take a.
possibility
Yeah, yeah, go
and
ahead.
that possibility you don't see in the Gita.
That possibility I do not see in the Gita. The Gita, in some senses, the Gita is, of course, a complex text.
Hmm.
Um, uh, it, uh, it turns the political subject into an empty self, as it were, uh,
Hmm.
uh, through which the divine force passes. So
Hmm.
there is no claim of selfhood in that self. It's completely desireless, completely unattached, right? So you can kill, but you can kill only if it is completely disinterested. There is some
Hmm.
power to that idea, right?
Hmm.
Nevertheless, the Gita, in that sense, because in modern times it gets plucked out of the Mahabharata, it is
Yes,
no
it does.
longer read as part of this larger story where it makes a different sense. But the moment it's plucked out of Mahabharata and then circulated in around the world as India's national philosophical text, such that it comes back to us via Schopenhauer and Hegel and so many others, then it's a different
Hmm.
Gita, right?
Hmm.
It's not so much the Mahabharata Gita anymore. So I think that while in modern times Gita has taken over, as it were, uh, there is also that one or two shlokas of Gita where, despite its tremendous abstraction, where gunas and swadharma and varna is mentioned, right?
Yes.
Now, it's an interesting uh, problem of what to do with the sociological or apparently sociological references
Hmm.
in a book of pure philosophy,
Right.
right? And
Hmm.
most modern thinkers took two extreme positions. Ambedkar entirely saw it as a fratricidal Brahmanical Hindu text,
Right.
and others completely glossed over the fact that there is talk of Swadharma and Varnadharma and Kshatriya Dharma in that text.
Including
Now,
Mahatma Gandhi.
including, of course, Mahatma Gandhi,
Hmm.
including Mahatma. Of course, the only unexpected person who tied himself up in knots trying to make sense of those caste, so-called caste references is the great Brahmin Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay,
Hmm. Hmm.
because he didn't know what to do with, because he wrote this massive detailed commentary of Gita. He didn't know what to do with those two or three shlokas. So he writes a separate essay
Hmm.
asking what is the relationship between karma as action and caste labor.
Hmm.
And he's not really able to deal with it. But at
Hmm.
least we can see that struggle in him. But
Right.
most other people completely glosses over Gandhi, Tilak,
Hmm.
Telang, whoever. Most people simply gloss over it. Sahajanand Saraswati, in his own peasant politics, also mobilizes the Gita differently from Gandhi. But as far as I remember, I may be wrong here, I have to look it up again. Even Sahajanand Saraswati does not address the caste question via the Gita, uh, uh, in the Gita or via the Gita, as far as I
Hmm.
can remember. But I could be wrong here because I have to revisit it. But
Hmm.
yes, I find the Gita requires exemplary subjects. The Panchatantra elicits ordinary subjects, and I find the Panchatantra more interesting
Hmm.
and more widely available in so many ways.
Hmm. Right. I uh, would fully agree with you on the importance of Panchtantra. However, I mean, we have been all groomed up in that kind of modern higher education where political philosophers' engagement with Gita has been always looked up as something. But you are right in your observation that unfortunately, Gita that happens in the Bhishma Parva of Mahabharata is never read in relation with the Adi Parva of Mahabharata.
Absolutely.
And if you do this cross reading of various parvas in Mahabharata, meaning of one episode changes entirely. To understand the subjectivity of Arjun in battlefield, one has to remember what he was in Adi Parva. In Adi Parva, he was
Absolutely.
the hero. He was celebrated as unparalleled, triumphant. I mean, the archer who would nobody can match. So,
Sure, sure.
in that
Yeah.
way, from the first question itself, this has been. the first part of the deliberation of this conversation, this question of history has been echoing in my head. I mean, what do historians do with archives these days? Because at one point of time, archive was a kind of, if one can say, it was a kind of fetishized field work for historians, the way field work is a fetish for anthropologists. I mean, they think just by going to the
Mm.
field, they can write a good ethnography. And not to demean the importance of archive, but we have also understood the politics of archive,
Oh, yes, indeed,
right?
indeed.
And
Mm.
in this kind of time when archive may not be so easily accessible, would or in general, would historiography undergo any transformation, or
Hmm.
even this new situation, new kind of questions emerging? Do you think historians need to
Hmm.
rethink their craft of doing history,
Hmm.
or I don't know?
You're right, you're right, you're
Before
right.
pandemic broke out, Ginsberg traveled to India, and I saw everybody rushing to listen to him. And immediately after that, we have this pandemic, and I was thinking how everybody would respond to Ginsberg now.
Sure, sure. No, archive is a very, very difficult question. So let us say by about the 1990s, the
Hmm.
debate amongst historians, especially modern historians, was regarding the representativeness of archives.
Right.
Meaning that given the fact that archives consist of primarily colonial documents or
Hmm.
state documents, or let us say vernacular tracts were mostly written by literate upper caste middle class men,
Hmm.
did these archives actually capture the voice of the subaltern?
Hmm.
So the big question which Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak rhetorically posited as can the subaltern speak was the
Hmm.
primary question of
Hmm.
how to recover voices of peasants and tribals and and Dalits and such like. Now, in course, this is something that I faced when I did my first work because I was, while working with time, I was working with also the people, the Santal people. And of course, they were primarily oral people, and it was very difficult to access, sense their presence in colonial archives and such like.
Hmm.
Soon, however, the question subtly began to change in multiple ways. One was through the rise of visual texts and images as an archive. And it came to light, especially with work of people like Tapati Guha or Christopher Pinney and such like, that this circulation, or the popular circulation of images
Hmm.
amongst the common people who might not read but have definitely a calendar on their wall or things like that, bazaar pictures,
Hmm.
grub street pictures and such, that can we rewrite history via visuals. And that was a very, very interesting turn. For instance, the argument came up that even though we might have thought that the so-called somebody like Bhagat Singh was a small episode in the larger story of Indian anti-colonial mass movement, among the common people primarily had pictures of Bhagat Singh.
Right.
In other words, the leftist critique of
Hmm.
revolutionary terrorism as individualistic, as elite, and as not taking the masses along was fell through because it was clear that in some ways Bhagat Singh was a far more known name than in the 1920s than Jawaharlal Nehru was. Let me
Hmm.
put it like that, or many Congress leaders were. So there was this turn towards non textual archives that gave some access to popular mentality, etc., which texts did not. So that was one change that happened. At the same time, a large number of historians began doing contemporary ethnography to supplement
Hmm.
textual archives. Again, work amongst the Adivasis of Bastar, for instance, Ajay Sakaria's book called Hybrid Histories is a bringing together of textual archive and interviews. Work on Gujarat peasantry, Vinayak Chaturvedi's work, whose recent work is on Savarkar, actually. Very interestingly, he
Oh,
worked on Gujarat peasants and now works on Savarkar. Should be out any time. He also combined, a kind of archival work with constant ethnography in that area. So we learned a lot from anthropologists, I have to say. That was a really productive turn in history. By the mid 2010s, however, things have become particularly complicated in two other ways. One is, of course, the realization that historians have today that we have to incorporate non-humans in our narratives. The non-human can be anything. It can be the planet, it can be the geologic or the atmosphere of the planet, it can be an entity like the virus, which is neither life nor non-life. It could be animals, it could be what we knew as nature, quote unquote, it could be energy forms, it could be carbon, it could be anything else, or it could be machines. Frankly, now people are beginning to imagine history in terms of a hybrid historical subject, which is of the non-human, human, and machinic, right? And the sense that our contemporary existence is actually that kind of an existence of hybridity, and the subject of history is as much the non-human, as much the machinic as is the human. Now the question, can they speak, is a pointless question. So the can the subaltern speak point cannot be transferred to this moment, right? Because here speech is not at stake at all. So therefore, what is an archive which in some senses allows us to see the machinic story or the viral story is a big and difficult question. I have a colleague in CSDS called Avadhendra Sharan, whom you may or may not know.
yes.
So his book is also coming out by the end of this year. He's written a history of a modern history of air pollution, of air, right? So he calls his book Smoke and Dust. And many of our discussions used to be how to find smoke and dust in an archive. You see what I mean? So he had when he checked out Bombay archives, he checked out Calcutta archives, he was doing Delhi archives, looking for entities that have agency in our lives,
Right.
but that do not exist as agents in our archives. It's a really, really tough call. So the question of archive is inflected by this new question that we are facing. The other thing that has made the archive question very difficult is, of course, again in modern times, ancient or medieval historians might not be facing this as much, but modern historians do, which is a surplus of records. Right now that we are into the digital age,
Right.
and everything that we do leaves a trace which can be called an archival trace, including our conversation right now.
Right.
What does a historian of the contemporary select as an archive with a closure? Our entire life is, in some senses, a total archive, right? Everything that we do, the movement we make on the street with a mobile in our pocket is registered as records in terms of location tracing, as do GPS. So how does a historian of the future, let us say if your son or daughter makes the mistake of becoming a historian, what will he or she do with this total archive in which there is no selectivity, no closure whatsoever? So these are the two tough archival questions that we face as historians today.
Hmm. No, wonderful. I mean, this is really a blessing in disguise as well as a great challenge to everyone.
Absolutely. Mm,
Yeah.
mm.
This, I mean, having heard all these things from you in this short span, uh, one gets curious about your own intellectual biography, in which a lot of these things might have emerged. I mean, intellectual biography in the sense that the kind of critical moments in your intellectual training orientation, which might have
Okay. Mm,
enabled
mm.
you to be so gritty about thinking of history in this manner. Uh,
Tough question. I mean, one really has to become a very big person to think of one's life in a kind of, in that kind of an autobiographical mode, which
uh,
I've reached the age, but I don't think I've reached the,
uh,
the
no,
glamour of
just to
doing
make
that.
sense of
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Sure, sure. No, no. I'm just
etymology, it's
joking.
important to,
Sure.
yeah.
So let me put it like that: I grew up in Bengal, in a
Mm,
small town, till my class 12th, and for obvious reasons, I grew up in a very very what should I say, charged political atmosphere,
mm,
where not only was Marxism and Leninism, Gramsci were like bandied about all the time,
mm.
but there was also already a critique of mainstream leftism that had emerged,
All right.
right? Because this was, let us say, the late 80s,
Mm,
early 90s, and the left had been in power for a while. In some senses, my current book comes from that experience where we thought everything was political, every
mm,
aspect of life was political, and we were like heavily politicized people.
mm,
So my turn towards, even though actually I loved physics when I was in school and did very well in physics
mm,
and maths, my turn towards this, and with great disappointment of all my seniors, I
mm.
turned to history because I had to do politics basically. And
Okay.
to me, the only way in which one could live in this world was to do politics.
Mm,
So I chose history. That was also the time when subaltern studies had begun to make its mark in Bengal academia. So already by my first year, second year BA, we were all voraciously beginning to read Ranajit Guha and people like that, and were of course, as expected, part of various strands of Naxalite politics as it used to be at those times. So that was a combined political and academic training that I went through. Um, but also because I got into left politics so early in life and saw it so closely, and then I became a member of CPI-ML and IPF, which was very big in the early 90s.
in
Uh,
Calcutta.
Not so much in Calcutta, but in North India.
Okay.
But we had connections through various groups to. I had come, then I would come to Delhi for my MA
Mm,
from Bengal.
mm.
So by then, IPF had its massive rally in Delhi. I don't know, you might be too young to remember this, but it
Yeah.
had a massive rally.
Mm,
In it really changed the city for some days.
mm.
So we were all part of IPF, and I did ML politics. I did student politics then while I was in Delhi and such like. But precisely because we were so ingrained in left politics, we also very quickly figure out the limits of standardized ideological left politics.
Right.
And because we were also reading and writing voraciously, and I think Mandal Commission was also an eye opener
Mm,
at that time. Coming from Bengal, before Mandal Commission, and coming, being a Banerjee from a progressive family,
mm,
I never ever registered caste while I was growing up. I
mm.
didn't even register it. Uh, um, uh, in the sense that we would of course laugh about those who still wanted to marry within the caste group and such like, but it was, we never thought it was a real problem. I mean, what a big mistake that was we began to realize, especially with the Mandal Commission moment, but also because I came to North India. And it kind of really kind of took me back at the depth of the phenomenon called caste, even in our times. So that was for me a learning moment. And then Tiananmen Square happened, which again made us even more, disturbed about left establishment or communist establishment as we saw it. And we saw how the Indian left responded to Tiananmen Square and such. Like, we were not comfortable. So even as we retained our a sense of being a Marxist, I think I probably still am, in kind of intellectual and even ordinary sensibility, perhaps. We had to, in some ways, look out of that paradigm, and many things started registering to me personally. Things about how, for instance, quote unquote archaic concepts still operate in our languages. The way we use so many terms such as dharma or rasa, or in our ordinary everyday language, without ever attending to these terms, as it were. What do these actually mean, really? Led me to look into other textual traditions or siyasat. ये सियासती कार्रवाई है, सियासत का, where does the term siyasat come from, and what is its conceptual history, is something that took me to these other traditions which had been completely junked by modern social sciences and modern humanities and our modern Indian academia. Of course, a big question was about religion, which again, I mean, all of us, I mean, I probably still am an atheist, grew up as an atheist, even in the most crisis moments of life. I don't think I have been able to really pray ever. But the fact remains that I now understand that while there are extreme orthodox and oppressive aspects of religion, there are also amazing insights in so many religious traditions about the human condition, about our cosmic connections. And so I went to these aspects of which made me do both things, which made me think about politics perhaps slightly differently. So am I a secular? I may be an atheist, but am I a secularist? I don't know. I'm not sure. Perhaps not. You see what I mean? The kind of difficulty with categories that one begins facing. But I also started questioning the standard disciplinary protocols as they were taught to me. So even as I studied history, learned historical techniques, I always was a little bit of an outsider to the historical discipline. And I read as much literature and as much anthropology and as much philosophy as I read history books. So basically, a kind of intellectual homelessness that then perhaps resulted in some possible interesting routes or paths that I could see.
All right.
So that's how I would describe myself, really. Apart from the fact that just the experience of life itself. So as a history student, I did, and I'm sure many of my friends did, face a mega struggle about, अरे तुम तो बहुत ज़्यादा philosophy करती हो, या तुम तो बड़ा theory करती हो. That kind of a thing, ना, वो आम बातों में जैसे होता है. Yeah, what kind of a topic of PhD can be time? What is your archive? I have no archive. So I looked at revenue papers, and I looked at calendars and panjikas, and I looked at novels and stories. So, I mean, it was totally a kind of uncertain experimental journey through the India Office Library. But I couldn't tell my supervisor on the first day, this is the archive I'm going to, because time has no archive.
Hmm.
So those kinds of things were rather difficult.
Hmm.
And now that I'm older, it doesn't bother me that much. But when I
Hmm.
was young and beginning,
Hmm.
I really felt claustrophobic and angry. And I remember my PhD defense was a tough one. It
Hmm.
went on for 4 hours,
Hmm.
where basically the thing I was fighting was my examiners were primarily saying that you do not have enough history books in your sources and bibliographies. You have other kinds of books and sources and bibliography. You have to place a thesis in the historical debate.
Hmm.
And apparently I was not doing that, though I thought I was, but so it was a tough one. So
Hmm.
those things troubled me a lot. Now it doesn't. I've outgrown those. I'm too old for all those now. But coming to the post-colonial, decolonial moment, I just want to, at the end, just say that while when I was writing in the mid-90s, my first book, late 90s or mid-90s, I was still at the post-colonial, decolonial moment in my own mind. In a sense, it was important for me to critique European forms of knowledge
Right.
or hegemonic forms of knowledge, etc., from perspective of the global South. Now we can say that.
Hmm.
Now I feel that we are at another stage where the
Hmm.
critique has been done,
Hmm.
and it has been done from various locations of Africa and Latin America and of course India.
Hmm.
The Latin American and the African academic, decolonial academic movement, literally, and the Indian post-colonial movement have been very successful in critiquing the Eurocentrism of even very contemporary thought.
Hmm.
I think now we need to step away from that critique mode and try to demonstrate in our actual practice, in our actual work, what an alternative philosophy or what an alternative conceptual world will look like. So
Hmm.
we have to show, but when we say an alternative conceptual world, it will not be an Indian conceptual world or an African or whatever, or a Bengali conceptual world. It will have to have, if not a universal claim, but a general claim, such that somebody working on French history might be able to find this set of concepts useful.
Hmm.
Right. So we will no longer say कि यूरोपियन थियोरी भारत में अप्लाई नहीं हो पाती है क्योंकि भारत की रियलिटी अलग है. भारत के कॉन्सेप्ट्स भारत में अप्लाई होना चाहिए. That's not what I'm saying.
Hmm.
I am saying that all concepts emerge from historically specific locations. After all, liberty, equality, fraternity is a local French slogan.
Hmm.
It becomes universal via its philosophical transformation, right?
Right.
So our task in our times is to move away from a critique of Eurocentrism to demonstrating how other kinds of concepts, which are not part of the European conceptual vocabulary, are also, universal, within quotes, let me say, universal concepts as well.
Hmm.
That there is another form of philosophy, a generic philosophy that is possible,
Hmm.
another form of thought about life that is possible,
Right.
but starting from other locations.
Hmm.
So it is then, in a sense, post-colonial
Hmm. Hmm.
or post-decolonial, as it were. So,
Wonderful. So, in a way, that also summarizes your ongoing project, which is theorizing the contemporary, of which you are part.
sure, yeah, exactly.
Hmm. But in that context, one can ask whether feminist critique of that universal uh, theory from nowhere, that general, uh, would this post-colonial theorizing
Mm.
depart from that old notion of general, which is from
Oh
nowhere?
yes, oh
Not at
yes,
all.
absolutely. It cannot reenact
Hmm.
Enlightenment universalism.
Exactly, exactly.
That's what all the fight was all about.
Hmm.
All I'm saying is that critique was crucial.
Hmm.
Uh, but having passed through that moment of feminist critique,
Hmm.
uh, is there a way in which we can think of generality
Hmm.
Via via other kinds of concepts, which is not the concept of reason with capital R, but via other kinds of conceptual roots. Generality, which is neither from nowhere, but is also not local
Right.
necessarily.
Hmm.
Right. So that's a tough one. It's easy to just say it in abstraction,
Hmm.
but it's far more actually difficult to do it in actual practice.
Hmm.
But I believe that is the task that uh, we have.
Right.
And having passed to that feminist critique, uh, uh, both in terms of the critique of the the impartial universal subject of reason,
Right.
but also the bringing on board of the idea of experience, and then the subsequent critique of the idea of experience by feminists themselves,
Yes.
and black feminists and Dalit feminists and such
Right.
like. I
Hmm.
think we have gone through those steps,
Hmm.
and only therefore can we arrive at this point where we can say that we are also pitching something
Hmm.
as equally general, but
Right.
not unmarked,
Hmm.
not unmarked, uh,
Hmm.
not neutral.
Hmm.
So
I thought
it's
you must be thinking of all your old Marxist colleagues when you have to crack a joke for yourself.
I certainly do. I
Uh,
certainly do.
because the leftover of left politics certainly gives plenty of
Oh,
chance
indeed.
to.
Oh, indeed. It's such a joke. Oh, my God.